In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the web. And more specifically, I suppose we're going to talk about the history of layout on the web. Why layout? Well, we want to see a little bit where we came from so we know where to go. Responsive web design is all about the future and how design is adapting to technology. So if we take a look at this, this is the first browser for the web. And we can see here that it's pretty basic from a design or layout sense. We've got some images, some hyperlinks, and then that's about it. Not a whole lot more. But what we did have was the ability to access this document from anywhere in the world that had an internet connection and a screen, as well as this browser. So to put layout in context, let's take a look at this quote by Jeffrey Zeldman. 9 times out of 10, the best web layout is the one which fully embraces the medium, by allowing itself to reflow as it's poured into different readers' individual computing setups. And that last layout we looked at largely did that. It reflowed based on the size of your screen. Oh, and when did Jeffrey say this? Oh, that's right, 1998 is when this was said. So this concept of a web design or layout that responds to the user's screen has been around for a while. But at the time, all we had to work with were tables. And HTML tables are really designed for data, but we had these layouts and we could put in some code here to create columns and rows, and they kind of look like this because, well, this was the beginning of the web, and the fact that you got this online was pretty cool to begin with. Table layouts could be surprisingly complex, capable of both fixed and fluid layouts, or even a combination of the two. A fixed width table looks like this, 800 pixels no matter how wide your browser window. A fluid or liquid layout, as it was sometimes called, stretched to a certain percentage of your browser window, 100% in this illustration. So let's take a look at an example of an old school table layout that's a combination of fixed and fluid. As the browser window contracts, all the content begins to reflow. And laugh, if you will, at the crude design, but these problems of how to deal with shifting content such as line length of text do not magically disappear with modern responsive design. At the time, tables were all developers and designers had to work with, but the code was too complex, making it more difficult to update and modify pages, and in any case, something better was on the way: cascading style sheets. Yes, CSS was here to save the day. Far less code was needed to achieve similar layouts, and it worked in harmony with HTML as a separate presentation layer. You could create a basic layout using a few lines of code and some HTML. Just like tables, you could have a fixed layout of 800 pixels, and you could create a fluid layout that stretched to 100% of the screen. So CSS became the best tool for the job at the time. There were some struggles along the way. We had issues such as browser incompatibilities, and the main problem here is that CSS definitely had some flaws and still has flaws of its own. For example, the concept of CSS floats. If you've done any CSS layout at all, this is old hat. Here we have 3 columns stacked on top of each other vertically. We apply some float left code or float right code to it, and we could stack these horizontally across the screen. The problem is this behavior was never really intended to give us true layout, such as rows and columns and grids. And so we had to come up with a number of different ways to create fluid width layouts using various hacks. We had browser incompatibilities and all sorts of other issues. Let's go back to Jeffrey's quote here, and I'm going to highlight this section. The best web layout is the one which fully embraces the medium by allowing itself to reflow. So let's talk about that reflowing part. And let's do a little detective work. Let's think about this. If we've been able to do these fixed layouts and fluid layouts, why haven't there been more fluid layout? Well, the truth is fluid layouts are actually very hard to build. There's all sorts of problems, as I mentioned before, browser incompatibilities. The floating and clearing aspects of web design is really not intuitive or even efficient. There's other factors as well. Keep in mind that the size of screens largely was the same for many years. So we had this range of about 640 by 480 at the low end to 1024 by 768 at the high end. So the truth is you could get away with fixed layout in this range and not really have to worry about other size screens. And finally, if we're also being honest with ourselves, Designers liked fixed width and still like fixed width because it gives them control. It gives them control over the placement of rows and columns and the size of images. And visually speaking, it's much more satisfying to work within a fixed width canvas than to try to make it work in Fluid. But something came along that made all of this a moot point. Yes, our friend the iPhone here, as well as other smartphone devices that were able to browse the web using this very small screen that you could hold in the palm of your hand. So to jump ahead a little bit, how does the iPhone and other smartphones scale a website such as this one when you browse it? The default method, which is included in the web browser, is to simply scale the site and allow the user to pinch and zoom if they want to read something in the left column or to look at an image, for example. This creates its own set of problems, something we'll be exploring a little later on. So if you're not happy with this pinch and zoom behavior, what might you do? You might do something like this, which is to create an entirely different website designed specifically for a smaller screen. In this case, a single column layout with no images and links. We call these m-dot sites because they typically live on their own domain, such as m.cnn.com or m.hbo.com. So these sites came along, and they did solve somewhat this problem of having the smaller screen, but guess what? They introduced another problem. So think about this scenario. You're on your iPhone and you want to send a link for someone else to read, and so you send it to them and they open it up on a desktop and it looks like this. But they often introduce other problems as well. For example, maybe there's content missing on the mobile site and this defeats the user's expectation. Also, from the backend, they have to be maintained separately from the desktop version. This creates all sorts of versioning issues where it's quite possible on a news site that you have news that's recent on the desktop but doesn't show up on the mobile. So what is the answer? Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next lesson as we take a look at the fundamentals of responsive web design.